E.T. made you believe in magic and friendship. Then Atari said, what if we made kids hate that adorable alien instead? Back in the day, game companies looked at awesome movies and thought, we can totally ruin this for everyone. These 10 of the worst video game adaptations of classic movies didn't just suck, they straight up destroyed childhood dreams one broken controller at a time. Stick around because our number 1 pick was so terrible, it literally helped crash the entire video game industry. Starting off our countdown at number 10, we have Howard the Duck for Commodore 64 and Apple II. Howard the Duck was already a disaster when it hit theaters in 1986. This thing was supposed to be George Lucas's next big hit after Star Wars, but instead it nearly killed his career. The movie was about a wisecracking duck from another dimension who gets stuck on Earth. Someone looked at that train wreck of a movie and said, you know what this needs? A video game that's even worse. The Howard the Duck game came out the same year, and somehow they managed to make something more painful than sitting through the actual movie. The game looked like garbage, even for 1986. Howard looked like he was wearing dirty pajamas instead of being a cool space duck. The bad guys were just black blobs with eyeballs, and the final boss looked like a walking piece of poop. Everything moved slower than dial-up internet. You had to wander around boring mazes hoping to find random stuff, but the controls were so broken you could barely move Howard without wanting to punch your computer screen. The game didn't even follow the movie story, instead making up some random plot about Howard being a detective in Hawaii. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button so we can continue to bring you more content like this. Coming in at number 9, Friday the 13th for Nintendo. The original Friday the 13th movie created Jason Voorhees, one of the most terrifying killers in horror history. Camp Crystal Lake became this legendary scary place that made every kid afraid to go to summer camp. When Nintendo got the rights in 1989, kids were pumped. Finally a chance to fight Jason and maybe not die horribly for once. Instead, what we got was one of the most confusing and rage-inducing games ever put on a cartridge. The biggest problem was navigation. Camp Crystal Lake was turned into this massive, confusing maze that made no logical sense. You'd push right on your controller and sometimes move left because of how messed up the map was. Kids would spend hours just getting lost in the same woods over and over again. The game never explained how anything worked. You could pick up random items like candles or matches, but good luck figuring out what they were for. When you finally found Jason, the fight was this weird wrestling minigame that used the worst controls imaginable. If you lost, that counselor was dead forever, and without the special weapons that were basically impossible to find, you had zero chance of winning. Number 8 on our countdown is Terminator 2 Judgment Day for Game Boy. Terminator 2 was absolutely mind-blowing when it came out in 1991. James Cameron basically invented the future with those special effects, and Arnold Schwarzenegger gave us the coolest robot hero ever. The Game Boy version that came out in 1993 took all that epic awesomeness and somehow squeezed it into the most disappointing handheld game ever made. We're talking about a game so short and pointless that you could beat it faster than it took to microwave a Hot Pocket. What made it so terrible was that most of the cool stuff from the movie just wasn't there. No motorcycle chase through the mall, no epic hospital escape, no dramatic confrontation with the scientist guy. Instead, you got 6 tiny levels that felt like they were made by someone who maybe saw a commercial for the movie once. You could literally finish the entire game during one commercial break of a Saturday morning cartoon. At number 7, we've got Cool World for Super Nintendo. Cool World was this weird 1992 movie that tried to mix real people with cartoons, kind of like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but way more confusing. Ocean Software looked at that movie and somehow managed to create one of the ugliest and most frustrating games on the entire Super Nintendo. The graphics were absolutely horrible, even for early Super Nintendo standards. Everything looked really cheap and creepy instead of cool and stylish. The real killer was the control scheme. For some completely insane reason, they mapped the jump button to Y instead of B like every other platformer game. Kids would die over and over again because they kept hitting the wrong button, trying to jump and instead throwing punches at thin air. Everything else controlled like you were moving through thick mud. We're halfway through our countdown of gaming's biggest movie adaptation disasters. Coming up, we've got a game that was so broken it helped destroy an entire company, and our number 1 pick that literally crashed the video game industry. Number 5, GhostBusters, an amazing movie turned into a game with problems that made it even more annoying to play. The most infamous issue was the control scheme that would randomly flip on you during the game. You're trying to jump over some slime or shoot at a ghost, and suddenly your controls decide to work backwards. Up becomes down, left becomes right, and you end up dying because your own controller betrayed you. The final level was pure torture. You had to beat the same super difficult maze 4 separate times, once with each Ghostbuster, while dodging way too many enemies and obstacles. By the time you struggled through it with one character, you immediately had to do the exact same thing with the next guy. Number 4 on our disaster countdown is The Terminator for Nintendo. The original Terminator movie was James Cameron's masterpiece of sci-fi horror back in 1984. Arnold Schwarzenegger created one of the most terrifying movie villains ever as the unstoppable killing machine from the future. By 1992, when the Nintendo version finally crawled out, this game was terrible in every single way imaginable. The graphics and sound were embarrassingly bad, even by Nintendo standards. Nothing looked like it belonged in the Terminator universe. The controls were designed by someone who apparently had never held a video game controller before. The character had to stop moving and crouch down every single time you wanted to shoot, making combat feel slower than watching paint dry. The difficulty was brutal, but not in any fun or fair way. You only got 3 lives with no way to continue, so every death sent you straight back to the beginning. Taking the number 3 spot, we have Predator for Nintendo. Predator was an absolutely brilliant action movie from 1987 that mixed military thriller with sci-fi horror. Arnold Schwarzenegger led a team of elite soldiers against an invisible alien hunter in the jungle. The Nintendo version that came out in 1989 looked at that serious, suspenseful masterpiece and somehow turned it into the most baffling and broken platformer ever created. Despite having the Predator right there on the cover looking all intimidating, the actual game barely had anything to do with the movie at all. Things get completely insane when you realize that instead of a jungle survival horror game, you control Dutch wearing a bright pink outfit while fighting random stuff like aliens, scorpions, floating bubbles, and even living rocks. None of this appeared in the actual movie. The controls were absolutely nightmarish and made basic movement feel impossible. Dutch would slide around like he was on ice after you stopped pressing buttons, making precise jumping this ridiculous challenge. Early in the game, you could only punch enemies, which was completely useless against basically everything. The level design was so confusing that the game actually included an on-screen arrow to help guide players. Number 2 on our countdown of gaming disasters is Back to the Future for Nintendo. Back to the Future was pure 1980s magic at its finest. Michael J. Fox as Marty McFly and Christopher Lloyd as Doc Brown created one of the most beloved time travel stories ever told. The Nintendo adaptation that came out in 1989 is legendary for all the wrong reasons. This thing is consistently ranked as one of the absolute worst games ever made on the system. The level design was mind-numbingly repetitive and boring. Most of the game was just Marty walking down streets that all looked exactly the same, avoiding random stuff like bullies, bees, and moving platforms. The levels only changed colors, so it felt like playing the same boring section over and over again for hours. The mini-games based on movie scenes were designed to make kids throw their controllers at the TV. The part where you had to throw milkshakes at bullies used terrible camera angles and demanded you hit 50 enemies without missing even one shot. And if you failed any of these mini-games, the game would send you back an entire level. The difficulty was completely unforgiving in every possible way. Marty was super fragile and would die from touching basically anything. The absolute worst part was that there were no continues and no password system to save your progress. That meant if you made a single mistake after hours of playing, you had to start the entire game over from the very beginning. And finally, taking the number 1 spot as the absolute worst movie adaptation ever created, E.T. the Extraterrestrial for Atari 2600. Steven Spielberg's E.T. was a complete masterpiece that touched hearts all around the world when it came out in 1982. The film about a boy befriending a stranded alien became the highest-grossing movie of the entire decade. Atari's video game version, also released in 1982, is hands down the most infamous movie tie-in game ever created and deserves the title of worst adaptation of all time. This game was so catastrophically terrible that it didn't just disappoint kids, it literally helped crash the entire American video game industry and almost killed home gaming forever. The crazy development story goes like this. Atari paid massive amounts of money for the ET license, then gave one programmer just 5 weeks to create the entire game from scratch. 5 weeks. Most games back then took at least 6 months to make properly. The result was a broken nightmare that barely functioned as a video game. The main gameplay involved making ET levitate out of randomly placed pits while collecting pieces of his communicator device. The collision detection was so sensitive that if even one tiny pixel of ET touched a single pixel of a pit, down he went. Since these pits were everywhere and almost invisible on screen, kids spent most of their time falling into holes and struggling to get out. The controls were unresponsive and punishing in the worst possible way. Getting ET out of a pit required super precise joystick movements that the Atari's basic hardware made nearly impossible to pull off. Kids would fall into the same holes over and over again, lose all their progress, and find themselves trapped in these endless cycles of frustration. The commercial failure was absolutely historic and changed the video game industry forever. Despite huge initial sales based on the movie's popularity, word of mouth was so terrible that hundreds of thousands of unsold cartridges ended up buried in a New Mexico landfill. E.T. for Atari became this legendary cautionary tale about everything wrong with the video game business, and its reputation as the worst game ever made remains completely unchallenged almost 40 years later. And there you have it, 10 movie adaptations that prove game developers in Hollywood should probably stick to their own lanes. These digital disasters took beloved films and turned them into virtual torture devices that made an entire generation of kids question their life choices. Did you suffer through any of these gaming nightmares back in the day? Drop a comment and let us know which adaptation destroyed your childhood the most.